Hey guys, tonight we're traveling to ancient Egypt to answer a question that might make your manager mysteriously stop recommending this channel. How did the people who built pyramids, carved colossal temples, and created one of history's greatest civilizations somehow end up with more time off than many of us today? So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Picture yourself waking just before sunrise in ancient Egypt. The first rays of light spill across the Nile, turning the river into a ribbon of gold. Palm trees sway gently in the morning breeze, birds chatter from the reeds, and somewhere nearby, a donkey has already decided today is the perfect day to file a formal complaint with the entire village. The donkey has many opinions. None of them are useful. You stretch, step outside your mud brick home, and prepare yourself for another day of work. At least, that's what you expect. If you've clicked on this video imagining ancient Egyptians spending every daylight hour dragging enormous limestone blocks through the desert, while a furious overseer shouted motivational phrases that would definitely violate modern workplace policies, you're in for a surprise. It's one of history's most persistent myths. The pyramids are so famous that they've completely overshadowed the lives of the millions of ordinary people who never laid a hand on one. The truth is, you probably aren't a pyramid builder. Instead, you're much more likely to be a farmer, a potter, a brewer, a fisherman, a carpenter, or, if fortune smiles upon you, a scribe. Becoming a scribe is rather like discovering the office job of the ancient world. You spend less time lifting heavy objects and more time making sure everyone else knows exactly how many heavy objects they were supposed to lift. Your greatest physical challenge is occasionally running out of ink. Whatever your profession, your life isn't controlled by a 5-day work week, an alarm clock, or someone asking if you have just 5 minutes for a quick meeting. Ancient Egypt has no meetings that could have been an inscription. Instead, your schedule follows something far older and far more reliable: the Nile. Unlike modern calendars, where every Monday somehow arrives with remarkable confidence despite nobody inviting it, the Egyptian year rises and falls with the river. Nature decides when work begins, when it slows, and when it stops altogether. You can argue with your supervisor. You cannot argue with several billion tons of water. That changes everything. Of course, don't imagine life as one endless holiday beside the river. Fields still need planting, canals must be maintained, livestock cared for, bread baked, beer brewed, tools repaired, and houses patched after every season. Ancient Egypt survived for more than 3,000 years because ordinary people were exceptionally good at their jobs, but they were also practical. When the Nile flooded, vast stretches of farmland disappeared beneath water. You cannot plough a field that has temporarily become part of the river. You also can't complain that the crops are behind schedule when the crops are technically underwater. Even the strictest foreman has to admit defeat at that point. For many farming communities, this meant that the pace of life changed dramatically during different seasons. Some months demanded exhausting labour from sunrise until dusk. Others offered unexpected breathing room, opportunities to repair equipment, work on public projects, visit relatives, attend festivals, or simply enjoy a slower rhythm while waiting for the floodwaters to retreat. Imagine telling your boss, "I'd love to finish that project, but the Nile has swallowed my entire workplace." For once, that isn't an excuse. It's geography. Over the next few chapters, you'll discover that the ancient Egyptian calendar wasn't built around quarterly targets, productivity charts, or the mysterious modern tradition of pretending every email is urgent. It revolved around floods, harvests, religious celebrations, and a deep understanding that life moved in cycles rather than non-stop deadlines. Ironically, the people who built one of history's greatest civilizations also seem to understand something many of us are still trying to learn. Working hard doesn't necessarily mean working every single day until you forget what free time feels like. Ancient Egyptians certainly knew how to labour. They just also knew when even the river was telling everyone to take a break. Now that you've discovered your life isn't spent endlessly hauling pyramid stones across the desert, it's time to meet your real supervisor. The Nile. Unlike modern employers, the Nile doesn't send emails at 11 o'clock at night or schedule meetings that could have been a two-sentence conversation. It simply floods, recedes, and quietly reminds everyone that arguing with nature is generally a poor career move. If you live in ancient Egypt, your entire year revolves around this remarkable river. Every summer, heavy rains falling hundreds of miles away in the Ethiopian highlands cause the Nile to swell. Weeks later, those waters arrive in Egypt, spilling over the riverbanks and covering the surrounding fields with rich black silt. To modern eyes, it might look like a natural disaster. To you, it's the reason your family eats next year. Without these floods, Egypt would mostly be desert. The ancient Egyptians even had a saying that Egypt was the gift of the Nile. It wasn't an exaggeration. Nearly every village, farm and city depended on this annual cycle. The river provided drinking water, fish, transportation, fertile farmland, clay for bricks, reeds for baskets and boats, and endless opportunities for crocodiles to remind everyone that swimming required careful planning. Because the Nile followed a predictable rhythm, so did your work. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons, each lasting about 4 months. The first season was Akhet, the season of inundation, when the floodwaters spread across the fields. Next came Pere, the season when the water retreated and farmers planted crops into the fresh, nutrient-rich soil. Finally came Shemu, the harvest season, when grain had to be gathered before the scorching heat arrived. Every occupation adjusted to these seasons. If you're a farmer, your busiest months aren't determined by a manager staring at spreadsheets. They're determined by whether your fields are underwater or dry enough to plant. During the flood season, ploughing is impossible because your wheat field has temporarily become part of the Nile. Surprisingly, oxen are not enthusiastic about underwater farming. Instead, this quieter period often allows you to repair tools, strengthen canals, help with community building projects, or work for the state on temples and monuments. If you're a fisherman, however, life barely slows down at all. The river is your office, and business remains open. The fish, unfortunately, never seem to recognize public holidays. Scribes remain busy recording harvest estimates, collecting taxes, tracking supplies, and writing official documents. Bureaucracy, it turns out, has always been one of humanity's most durable inventions. As you settle into this rhythm, one thing becomes clear. Ancient Egyptians didn't organize life around the clock. They organized it around the river. And unlike your phone's calendar, the Nile almost never forgot what day it was. The flood has arrived. A few weeks ago, you were walking through neat rows of farmland, checking your tools and wondering whether this year's harvest would be generous. Today, you're standing at the edge of what looks suspiciously like a very large lake where your fields used to be. Oddly enough, this is excellent news. If you're an ancient Egyptian farmer, the annual inundation isn't a catastrophe. It's the beginning of the most important season of the year. The muddy water slowly spreads across the floodplain, leaving behind a fresh layer of fertile black silt. Without it, the soil would soon become exhausted, harvests would shrink, and dinner would become considerably less interesting. But while the flood nourishes the land, it also creates one unavoidable problem. You can't farm underwater. You can stare at your submerged field as long as you like. The wheat will not politely begin growing beneath 3 feet of water, simply because you're feeling optimistic. Ancient Egyptians respected nature, largely because nature had an excellent record of winning every argument. For the next several weeks, your usual farming routine simply stops. Now, that doesn't mean everyone spends months reclining beneath palm trees while servants peel grapes. Despite what some Roman writers later implied about luxury, most Egyptians remained busy. The difference was that they became busy doing different things. This was often the season for repairing houses damaged during the previous year. Mud brick walls needed fresh plaster. Roofs required maintenance. Granaries were inspected. Irrigation canals were cleaned and strengthened before the water retreated. Boats were repaired, tools sharpened, baskets woven, and fishing nets patched. Think of it as the world's largest home improvement season, except there isn't a hardware store, and forgetting one tool might mean walking several miles to borrow it from your cousin. The flood season also allowed the state to gather large numbers of workers for public projects. This is where the pyramids enter the story. Contrary to old myths, many historians believe that a significant portion of the labour force working on royal monuments consisted of farmers who were temporarily free because their own fields were underwater. Instead of sitting idle, they contributed labour to projects sponsored by the pharaoh, receiving food, clothing, housing, and often beer as payment. Being paid partly in beer sounds unusual today. Then again, modern companies occasionally reward employees with branded coffee mugs, so perhaps history hasn't changed quite as much as we'd like. Beer in ancient Egypt wasn't simply a luxury. It was nutritious, safer than questionable water sources, and a normal part of the daily diet for adults and children alike. Receiving beer as part of your wages wasn't a bonus, it was practical. The flood season also gave families something increasingly rare in the modern world. Time. Time to repair relationships, visit neighbouring villages, prepare for upcoming festivals, teach children practical skills, and simply live at a pace dictated by nature instead of deadlines. Life certainly wasn't effortless, but it wasn't an endless sprint either. Ironically, the busiest river in Egypt created one of the quietest seasons for the people who depended on it most. Just as you begin settling into the rhythm of the Nile, you discover something else that shaped your work schedule. The gods apparently enjoyed a good celebration. A very good celebration. Ancient Egypt wasn't home to just one or two major religious holidays. Depending on where you lived and which period of history you happened to occupy, the calendar was packed with festivals honouring dozens of different gods and goddesses. Some lasted a single day. Others stretched on for several days, filling temples, streets and riverbanks with music, feasts, processions, and enough incense to make the entire city smell like an expensive candle shop. For you, these weren't optional weekend activities. Religion was woven into every part of daily life. The gods controlled the flood, the harvest, the sun, the afterlife, and just about everything else that mattered. If a festival honoured one of them, the community paid attention. That often meant work slowed down or stopped entirely. Imagine you're a carpenter halfway through building a new boat. Today you plan to finish the hull. Instead, your neighbour knocks on the door before sunrise. The procession starts in an hour. Well, the boat can wait. Throughout Egypt, temple priests carried sacred statues of the gods through the streets, usually hidden inside beautifully decorated shrines resting on ceremonial barges, or carried on poles by teams of priests. Most ordinary people never saw the statue itself, but they gathered along the roads to watch the procession pass, believing they were sharing a moment with the divine. The atmosphere was nothing like the silent temples many people imagine today. Musicians played harps, flutes, drums, and rattles called sistrums. Singers performed hymns while dancers entertained the crowds. Families wore clean linen clothing, children ran through busy streets, merchants sold food and drink, and neighbours who rarely had time to visit each other suddenly spent the entire day together. It was equal parts religious ceremony, community gathering, and neighbourhood party. Honestly, if your modern office celebrated quarterly reports with free bread, music, and beer instead of PowerPoint presentations, attendance might improve considerably. One of the grandest celebrations was the Opet festival in Thebes. During this festival, the statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu travelled from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple in magnificent processions. Thousands of people lined the route. Food was distributed, offerings were made, and the celebration reinforced both the power of the gods and the authority of the pharaoh. For ordinary Egyptians, it was also a welcome break from routine. The same was true of many local festivals dedicated to village gods. Not every celebration reached the scale of Opet, but almost every community had occasions that brought work to a temporary halt. This wasn't laziness. It was considered essential. Maintaining harmony between humans and the gods, what Egyptians called ma'at, was believed to keep the entire universe functioning properly. Good harvests, peaceful communities, and stable government all depended upon preserving that balance. So if someone questioned why work had paused for another religious celebration, the answer was quite simple. Because a healthy universe seemed slightly more important than finishing the fence before lunchtime, and remarkably, the civilization managed to last for over 3,000 years with that philosophy. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. Every time you start thinking ancient Egypt must have been one endless cycle of work, another festival appears, another religious procession winds through the streets, or another season changes your entire routine. If you were keeping track of your workdays on a modern calendar, you'd probably need an extra colour just for holidays. And there were plenty of them. Historians estimate that throughout the year, Egyptians observed dozens of religious festivals. Depending on the period and the city where you lived, there could be around 60 to more than 100 festival days annually. Some were celebrated across the kingdom, while others belonged to local temples or particular gods worshipped only in certain regions. That doesn't mean everyone spent 1/3 of the year doing absolutely nothing. Life still had to continue. Animals still needed feeding. Bread still had to be baked. Someone still had to remember where the goats had wandered off to. Goats, much like toddlers, seemed naturally gifted at appearing exactly where they weren't supposed to be. But compared to modern work schedules, these holidays genuinely interrupted ordinary life. Take a typical village. Normally, the streets are filled with people carrying grain, repairing fishing nets, shaping pottery, or hauling water from the river. Then a festival arrives, and everything changes. Homes are cleaned, fresh linen comes out of storage, musicians gather in public squares, and families prepare special meals they may have been looking forward to for weeks. The temples become the centre of attention. Priests perform rituals from dawn until nightfall, burning incense and presenting offerings of bread, fruit, vegetables, flowers, meat, beer, and wine before the statues of the gods. While much of the ceremony remains inside the temple itself, the celebrations often spread into the surrounding streets, where ordinary Egyptians could join in feasting and entertainment. The smell alone would have been unforgettable. Fresh bread baking in clay ovens, roasted duck and goose turning over open fires, sweet dates and figs piled high in woven baskets, beer flowing almost as reliably as the Nile itself. Frankly, if your office holiday party involved roasted goose instead of slightly stale sandwiches, morale surveys would probably improve overnight. These celebrations weren't simply excuses to enjoy good food. They reinforced community. Neighbours who spent weeks working separate fields now gathered together. Families visited relatives in nearby villages. Children played games while older generations exchanged stories, news and gossip that had accumulated since the previous festival. And there was always gossip. Human civilization has successfully reinvented countless technologies over the millennia. It has never managed to eliminate gossip. Even the pharaoh understood the importance of festivals. Royal donations often helped pay for enormous public feasts. Grain, meat and beer could be distributed to large crowds, reinforcing the image of the king as both protector and provider. A well-fed population was generally a happier population, a lesson governments have been rediscovering ever since. As you stand among the crowds, watching musicians play beneath colourful temple banners while the aroma of fresh bread fills the warm Egyptian air, it's difficult not to notice something. These people worked hard, but they also believed that stopping work together, celebrating together, and enjoying life together wasn't a distraction from society. It was one of the reasons society held together in the first place. At some point, you begin to notice something strange. You've spent several chapters living in ancient Egypt, following the seasons, attending festivals, and enjoying the occasional unexpected break from farming. Yet we still haven't really talked about the pyramids. That's because, despite dominating every documentary ever made about Egypt, they occupied only a tiny fraction of most Egyptians' lives. Still, eventually curiosity gets the better of you. What if you volunteered to work on one? The first surprise arrives almost immediately. Nobody is chasing you across the desert with a whip. For generations, people believed the pyramids were built almost entirely by enslaved workers, forced into endless labour under brutal conditions. It made for dramatic movies, but archaeology has painted a very different picture. The workers who built the Great Pyramids at Giza were largely skilled labourers, craftsmen, and seasonal workers recruited from across Egypt. Many were farmers whose own fields lay beneath the Nile's floodwaters, leaving them temporarily available for state projects. Rather than wasting those months waiting for the river to retreat, they earned food, clothing, shelter, and wages by helping construct monuments for the pharaoh. It's less chains and misery, and more temporary government contract. Admittedly, the commute was considerably worse. As you arrive at the workers' settlement, you're surprised again. This isn't a chaotic camp of exhausted labourers sleeping in the sand. Rows of carefully planned houses stand nearby. Bakers prepare fresh bread. Brewers produce enormous quantities of beer. Kitchens serve meals every day, while physicians treat injuries and illnesses. Archaeologists have even discovered evidence that workers with broken bones received medical care and enough recovery time for those bones to heal properly before returning to work. Your employer may send you an email saying, "Feel better soon." The pyramid builders occasionally received actual health care. Lunch is far better than you expected. Workers consumed large amounts of bread and beer, but also onions, garlic, fish, vegetables, and surprisingly generous portions of beef, mutton, and goat. Feeding thousands of labourers required an enormous logistical operation. Herds of cattle arrived regularly, while grain shipments flowed constantly into the settlement. Building a pyramid burned an astonishing number of calories. Thankfully, so did carrying the groceries. Of course, this doesn't mean the work was easy. Far from it. Moving multi-ton limestone blocks required incredible teamwork, carefully organised crews, sledges pulled across lubricated paths, ropes, wooden levers, and years of experience. Skilled stonecutters shaped blocks with remarkable precision using copper tools and stone hammers. Surveyors measured every angle with astonishing accuracy, long before lasers or computer software existed. One mistake could affect hundreds of stones. No pressure. Interestingly, workers even gave their crews humorous names. Archaeologists have uncovered references to groups called things like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. Apparently, giving construction teams slightly ridiculous names is another tradition humanity never abandoned. Standing before the rising pyramid, covered in dust and sweat, you realise something important. These people certainly worked incredibly hard, but they weren't anonymous slaves toiling without purpose. They were organised professionals, contributing to one of history's greatest construction projects, and when their shift ended, many of them went home, shared dinner with their families, drank a few jars of beer, and prepared to do it all again tomorrow. When your time at the pyramid construction site comes to an end, you decide to visit another remarkable community. This time, you're heading south to a village unlike any other in ancient Egypt. Welcome to Deir el-Medina. Hidden against the desert cliffs near Thebes, this small settlement was home to the highly skilled craftsmen responsible for decorating and constructing the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. If the pyramid builders were the engineers of Egypt's greatest monuments, these men were the artists who ensured pharaohs entered eternity in style. After all, if you're going to spend forever in the afterlife, you might as well have nicely painted walls. The village itself is surprisingly orderly. Around 70 tightly packed mud brick houses line narrow streets. Every family knows every other family. Privacy is limited. If you burn tonight's bread, there's an excellent chance 3 neighbours will know before breakfast tomorrow. As you settle into your new routine, something stands out immediately. Your work schedule looks surprisingly civilised. Instead of labouring every single day, the craftsmen generally worked an 8-day cycle, followed by 2 days of rest. Those days off were valuable. You could repair your home, visit relatives, attend religious ceremonies, hunt in the nearby desert, or simply recover from the physically demanding work inside the royal tombs. Modern weekends suddenly seem slightly less revolutionary. Your working day begins early. You and your fellow craftsmen leave the village together, walking across the rocky desert toward the Valley of the Kings. The journey itself takes time, and once inside the tomb, everyone has a specialized role. Stonecutters smooth the walls, Plasterers prepare fresh surfaces. Artists sketch outlines using red pigment. Master painters refine every figure. Scribes carefully copy sacred texts that will guide the pharaoh through the afterlife. No one works alone. Building a royal tomb requires extraordinary teamwork, and many of these craftsmen spend decades perfecting their particular skills. Some families produce generations of artists, with sons learning directly from fathers who learned from grandfathers before them. You quickly realize this is less like temporary construction work and more like belonging to an elite guild. The government values your expertise. Workers receive regular rations of grain, beer, vegetables, fish, oil, and clothing instead of traditional wages. Records even show that when these deliveries arrived late, the craftsmen were not afraid to complain. In fact, they became famous for something historians still talk about today. One day, after repeated delays in receiving their food rations, the workers simply stopped working. They walked off the job, rather politely by ancient standards. This event, which took place during the reign of Ramesses III, is considered the first recorded labour strike in human history. Imagine explaining that to your supervisor. I'm participating in a 3,000-year-old workplace tradition. As evening approaches, you return home beneath the fading Egyptian sun. Children play in the streets while neighbours prepare supper. Conversations drift from one rooftop to another, mixing stories about work, family, temple festivals, and whatever amusing mistake someone made inside the tomb that day. Life here isn't luxurious. The houses are modest, the desert is harsh, and the work demands incredible precision. But it's also a stable community with regular rest days, skilled professions, organised labour, and workers confident enough to demand fair treatment when promises weren't kept. For a civilization over 3,000 years old, that's unexpectedly familiar. By now, you've met pyramid builders, tomb painters, and enough priests to suspect that ancient Egypt may have had more religious festivals than actual weekdays. But what about everyone else? After all, not every Egyptian spent life decorating royal tombs or hauling limestone. In fact, the overwhelming majority of people simply tried to earn a living, raise a family, and avoid making the tax collector noticeably interested in their existence. So today, you get to try 3 different careers. Let's begin as a farmer. Before sunrise, you're already awake. The air is cool. The Nile reflects the first light of dawn, and your ox is staring at you with the unmistakable expression of an employee who has absolutely no intention of helping until breakfast. Your responsibilities are endless. You plough fields, sow grain, repair irrigation ditches, weed crops, tend livestock, harvest wheat, and store grains safely before pests or moisture destroy months of work. When harvest arrives, life becomes exhausting. Every hour matters because waiting too long could ruin the crop. Entire families join together in the fields. Even children help with lighter tasks, learning from an early age that bread begins long before the bakery. Then the season changes. The flood arrives, your fields disappear beneath water, and suddenly your schedule becomes far less demanding. You still repair tools, maintain your home, or assist with public projects, but the frantic pace eases considerably. Now let's try becoming a craftsman. Instead of fields, your world smells of wood shavings, wet clay, molten copper, or freshly cut stone. Perhaps you're shaping elegant pottery. Perhaps you're weaving linen so fine that wealthy nobles proudly wear it to temple ceremonies. Or maybe you're building furniture for someone whose chair somehow requires more decoration than your entire house. Craftsmen usually enjoy steadier work throughout the year than farmers. Cities always need tools, baskets, sandals, jewellery, boats, statues, and household goods. Your income depends largely on your skill. The better your craftsmanship, the more valuable your work becomes. Of course, perfection takes time. One cracked vase can erase several days of effort. No pressure there. Finally, you become a scribe. Congratulations. After several days of working in the Egyptian sun, you've discovered one unavoidable truth. No one can function on an empty stomach. Fortunately, ancient Egyptians took food very seriously. Not in the modern sense of photographing every meal before eating it. Thankfully, no one is delaying lunch because the bread needs better lighting. Instead, food is simply fuel, essential for surviving long hours of physical labour beneath a blazing African sun. Your day usually begins early with a simple breakfast, a loaf of coarse bread, perhaps accompanied by onions, dates, figs, or leftover vegetables from the previous evening. If you're fortunate, there may be cheese or a little fish. Nothing extravagant, but enough to get you through the cool morning hours before the heat becomes relentless. Then comes work. Whether you're harvesting grain, shaping stone, or recording tax accounts, the Egyptian sun steadily climbs higher. By midday, the temperature can become oppressive. The light is so intense that even the stray village dogs seem to have collectively agreed that productivity is overrated until evening. So you stop, not because you're lazy, because continuing at full speed under the hottest part of the day would be both miserable and remarkably foolish. Many workers slowed their pace or took breaks during the afternoon heat whenever their duties allowed. Shade became one of the most valuable resources in Egypt. A tree, a mud brick wall, or a simple woven shelter could feel like a gift from the gods themselves. You find a cool spot beside your fellow workers. Lunch is already waiting. Fresh bread appears once again, because in ancient Egypt, bread is less of a food and more of a lifestyle. Alongside it come onions, garlic, lentils, beans, cucumbers, and perhaps salted fish, or a piece of roasted duck if you're celebrating something special. Then someone passes you a large pottery jar. Beer. Not the crystal clear beer you might imagine today. Egyptian beer is thick, cloudy, slightly grainy, and filling enough that you could almost chew parts of it. It contains relatively little alcohol by modern standards, but provides calories, nutrients, and hydration. For many workers, beer is consumed every single day. Children drink weaker versions. Adults drink stronger ones. Somewhere, a modern human resources department is collectively hyperventilating. Beer even forms part of many workers' wages. Records from construction sites show labourers receiving measured daily rations of bread and beer, carefully calculated according to their role and responsibilities. To an Egyptian worker, getting paid in beer isn't unusual. It's payroll. Of course, meals are about more than simply eating. This is when conversations happen. Workers exchange news from neighbouring villages, debate whether this year's flood will be generous, complain about stubborn donkeys, laugh about someone's failed attempt to catch a goose, or speculate about what the pharaoh might be building next. Remarkably, workplace gossip appears to be one of humanity's oldest surviving traditions. As the worst of the afternoon heat begins to fade, everyone gradually returns to work. The pace quickens again. Tools strike stone. Farmers return to their fields. Boats move along the Nile. The village comes alive once more. Watching this daily rhythm unfold, you realise something modern life often forgets. Ancient Egyptians weren't trying to squeeze every possible minute out of every day. They understood that people worked best when they respected the climate instead of trying to defeat it. Considering the sun above your head feels determined to melt both you and your sandals, it seems like a very sensible policy indeed. You've now spent enough time in ancient Egypt to notice something rather unexpected. People don't always show up for work. Shocking, isn't it? For a civilization famous for discipline, monumental architecture, and astonishing organisation, the Egyptians also left behind something wonderfully human: attendance records. And these records reveal that workers were, in many ways, exactly like us. Only their excuses were considerably more entertaining. The best evidence comes once again from Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders. The scribes carefully recorded who came to work each day, and more importantly, who didn't. If you fail to appear one morning, someone writes your name down. No disappearing quietly, no pretending nobody noticed. 3,000 years before digital attendance systems, there was already someone keeping track. The reasons for missing work are surprisingly familiar. You're sick, your wife is ill, your child has a fever, you hurt your foot, you were bitten by a scorpion. Fair enough. Scorpions generally make for a convincing excuse. Other absences are a little more creative. Perhaps you're attending the funeral of a relative. Perhaps you're making offerings to a family god. Perhaps you're helping repair your house after part of the roof collapsed. Mud brick homes were sturdy, but they occasionally reminded their owners that maintenance was not optional. Then there are the wonderfully ordinary reasons. One record simply notes that a worker stayed home because he was brewing beer. Imagine emailing your manager. Sorry, can't come in today. Busy making beer. Oddly enough, in ancient Egypt, that might actually be accepted. Another worker is absent because his donkey wandered off. Considering donkeys were essential for transporting goods, losing one was rather like discovering your delivery truck had decided to begin a new life several villages away. Someone else misses work while caring for his mother. Another because of eye pain. Another because he was mourning the death of a family member. These records paint a surprisingly compassionate picture. Life happened, and employers generally understood that. That doesn't mean workers could disappear whenever they pleased. The government still expected major projects to continue, especially royal tombs. Scribes monitored attendance carefully, and repeated unexplained absences certainly attracted attention. Even in ancient Egypt, there was probably one co-worker who mysteriously developed an illness every time heavy lifting was scheduled. Human nature, it seems, has enjoyed remarkable stability. Healthcare itself was also more advanced than many people imagine. Egyptian physicians treated broken bones, stitched wounds, prescribed herbal remedies, and diagnosed illnesses using surprisingly detailed medical knowledge for the time. Workers injured on major state projects often received treatment rather than simply being replaced. Medicine wasn't magical, but it wasn't primitive either. As you recover from your own sore muscles after weeks of labour, you begin to appreciate something else about Egyptian society. Its workers weren't viewed as endlessly replaceable machines. They were valuable people with families, illnesses, responsibilities, and lives beyond their jobs. For all its kings and monuments, ancient Egypt still depended on ordinary individuals showing up each morning, and occasionally not showing up at all. Apparently, calling in sick has a much longer history than anyone expected. If the flood season was ancient Egypt's opportunity to catch its breath, harvest season was the moment everyone stopped relaxing. Immediately. The Nile has long since retreated, the grain has grown tall beneath the Egyptian sun, and now the fields stretch before you like waves of gold. It is a beautiful sight. It is also a countdown. Because once the grain is ready, waiting is no longer an option. You wake before dawn. The air is still cool, and workers are already gathering with sickles tucked into their belts. Families move toward the fields together. Men, women, older children, neighbours, and hired labourers all have jobs to do. Even the village dogs seem unusually motivated, although mostly because they hope someone drops lunch. Today, every pair of hands matters. The wheat and barley must be cut before birds eat too much of it, before unexpected weather damages it, or before the dry stalks become too brittle. Ancient Egypt rarely suffered heavy rain, but wind, pests, and simple bad timing could still reduce months of hard work. This is not the season for taking things slowly. Harvesting begins with rows of workers cutting stalks using curved wooden sickles fitted with razor-sharp flint blades. Behind them, others gather the bundles and tie them together before carrying them to large threshing floors. There, cattle or donkeys walk in endless circles over the grain, separating the edible kernels from the stalks. The animals probably don't enjoy the process. They also aren't consulted. Next comes winnowing. Workers throw the mixture into the air using wooden forks or baskets. The breeze carries away the lighter chaff, while the heavier grain falls back to the ground. It looks surprisingly elegant, almost like a carefully practiced dance, provided you ignore the fact that everyone is covered in dust and sweating through their linen clothes. By midday, you're exhausted, your back aches, your hands are blistered, there is straw in places you didn't know straw could reach, and somehow there are still several fields left. Suddenly, those quieter weeks during the flood season make perfect sense. The Egyptian calendar wasn't designed to avoid hard work. It balanced periods of intense labour with periods of recovery. Modern life often spreads moderate stress across the entire year. Ancient Egypt preferred concentrating enormous effort into a few crucial seasons. Then came the tax collectors. Just when you think the hardest part is over, government officials arrive to measure the harvest. Scribes carefully record how much grain every field has produced, calculating the share owed to the state. Nothing escapes their attention, not even that suspiciously small grain pile you've been hoping nobody would compare with your unusually large field. Apparently, tax audits are another invention with ancient roots. Once the grain is safely stored inside massive granaries, however, an enormous weight lifts from the entire community. The food supply for the coming year is secure. Families celebrate. Workers finally slow their pace. Children return to playing instead of carrying baskets. For a few precious weeks, everyone can breathe again. You've just survived the busiest season in ancient Egypt, and unlike your overflowing email inbox, this workload actually comes to an end. At last, the harvest is finished. The granaries are full, the taxes have been paid, your tools are cleaned and stored away, and for the first time in weeks, you wake up without immediately wondering which field needs your attention. It feels strange, not because you're bored, because you've remembered that life isn't only about work. Ancient Egyptians certainly laboured hard when the seasons demanded it, but they also understood something surprisingly modern. People need time to enjoy themselves. As the afternoon sun softens, you wander into the village square. Children are everywhere. Some wrestle in the dust, while others throw small balls made from stitched leather and stuffed reeds. A few play with carved wooden animals pulled along by strings, while others invent games whose rules appear to change every 5 minutes depending on who is currently winning. Humanity also invented making up the rules as you go. Parents have been sighing ever since. Nearby, a group of older villagers has gathered around a beautifully carved game board. They're playing Senet, Egypt's most famous board game. The rules remain partly mysterious today, but to the Egyptians, it was far more than simple entertainment. The game symbolized the soul's journey through the afterlife, blending strategy, luck, and religious belief into something people could enjoy after supper. Imagine if every family Monopoly game also doubled as spiritual preparation for eternity. The arguments would somehow become even more intense. Music fills the air. A young woman plucks the strings of a harp, while another plays a flute carved from reed. Someone keeps rhythm with hand drums, while dancers clap and move gracefully through the gathering crowd. Children copy the adults with varying degrees of success, usually ending with someone tripping over a goat. The goat appears deeply unimpressed. Music is everywhere in Egypt. You hear it during festivals, weddings, religious ceremonies, family celebrations, and ordinary evenings like this one. Professional musicians perform for wealthy households, but every village has people who sing, clap, dance, and play simple instruments together. Entertainment doesn't require a ticket, it simply requires neighbours. As evening approaches, Families gather on rooftops where the cooler breeze offers relief from the day's heat. Stories begin to flow. Grandparents tell tales of clever gods, foolish kings, dangerous spirits, heroic ancestors, and animals that somehow always manage to outsmart humans. Some stories teach lessons, others exist purely because they're amusing. Fortunately, history has always made room for both. You notice something else. Nobody seems to be in a hurry. Conversations continue without someone constantly checking the time. Neighbours linger after dinner. Friends laugh over another jar of beer, while children slowly fall asleep beside their parents under skies filled with brilliant stars unspoiled by city lights. For most Egyptians, these simple moments were every bit as important as the hours spent working in the fields. A civilization isn't built only by labour. It's also built by shared meals, music, games, friendships, and evenings when the day's work is finally finished. Looking around the village, you begin to understand why ancient Egypt endured for thousands of years. Its people didn't simply know how to work. They also remembered how to live. After spending an entire year in ancient Egypt, something begins to feel unusual. Not here. About home. You think back to your modern life, where every weekday looks almost identical. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they blur together in a cycle of alarms, commutes, meetings, deadlines, and somehow receiving an email marked urgent at 4:58 on a Friday afternoon. The ancient Egyptians would probably have several questions. Most of them would begin with, why? Their lives certainly weren't easier. Life expectancy was shorter. Medicine was limited. Childbirth was dangerous. A poor harvest could threaten an entire community, and a single illness could change a family's future forever. Yet despite all those hardships, their relationship with work was fundamentally different. Work existed to support life. It wasn't expected to become life itself. Everything revolved around natural rhythms. When the Nile flooded, farming paused. When harvest arrived, everyone worked intensely. When festivals came, communities celebrated together. When the sun became unbearably hot, people slowed down whenever they could. Nature decided the schedule. Today, we often try to make the schedule ignore nature completely. Offices stay open whether it's snowing, raining, or 40 degrees outside. Supermarkets operate late into the night. Emails travel across continents in seconds. Someone, somewhere, is always working. The sun could explode tomorrow morning, and there would probably still be an online meeting scheduled for 9. Ancient Egyptians also understood something modern society sometimes struggles to accept. Rest had value. Not because resting increased productivity, because people needed it. Religious festivals weren't viewed as interruptions to work. They were part of the proper order of society. Family meals weren't squeezed into tiny gaps between appointments. They were daily rituals. Evenings belonged largely to conversation, storytelling, music, and community, because darkness naturally brought the working day to an end. There was no temptation to answer, just one more message. There wasn't even one more message. Perhaps the biggest difference lies in how success was measured. Today, people often ask what you do. In ancient Egypt, they were more concerned with whether your household was thriving, whether your family had enough grain stored for the coming year, whether your neighbours trusted you, and whether you lived according to Ma'at, the principle of balance, justice, and harmony that guided Egyptian society. Working harder simply for the sake of working harder would have seemed rather odd. Working well was what mattered. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize the past. Ancient Egyptians faced exhausting labour, heavy taxes, political instability, and years when the Nile flooded too much, or not enough at all. Their world could be brutally unforgiving. but perhaps they understood one timeless lesson. Life moves in seasons. Some seasons demand everything you have. Others allow you to recover, celebrate, and simply exist without feeling guilty for not being constantly productive. Looking back across more than 3,000 years, you begin to wonder whether the Egyptians were ahead of their time, or whether, somewhere along the way, we simply forgot that even the mighty Nile knew when it was time to slow down. As the sun sets over the Nile one last time, you find yourself asking the question that brought you here in the first place. Did ancient Egyptians really work less than you? The answer, perhaps frustratingly, is both yes and no. If you simply count the number of days spent working, many ordinary Egyptians probably did enjoy more breaks throughout the year than the average modern employee. Religious festivals regularly interrupted daily life. The annual flood paused farming for weeks. Seasonal work naturally created periods of intense labour, followed by quieter months. There was no expectation that every single day had to be equally productive. In that sense, your calendar in ancient Egypt might actually feel refreshing. But there's another side to the story. When work was necessary, it was genuinely hard. Harvest season demanded exhausting physical effort from sunrise until sunset. Farmers worked with simple hand tools, often barefoot beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. Craftsmen spent years mastering difficult skills. Quarry workers cut stone in suffocating heat. Boatmen fought strong currents, while labourers carried loads that would make most modern gym memberships seem slightly unnecessary. There were no tractors, no electric saws, no forklifts, and certainly no air conditioning. The closest thing to climate control was standing under the only tree for half a mile and hoping nobody else reached it first. Life itself was also far less comfortable. A toothache could become life-threatening. A broken leg might permanently change your future. Infant mortality was tragically common, and diseases we easily treat today could spread through entire communities. One poor Nile flood could mean hunger for thousands of families. Modern life has many frustrations. Ancient life had considerably fewer passwords, but significantly more parasites. Yet despite these hardships, there is something deeply appealing about the Egyptian rhythm of life. Their society accepted that human beings couldn't maintain the same pace every day of the year. Nature demanded flexibility, and people adapted accordingly. There was time to celebrate, to mourn, to gather with family, to honour the gods, to repair homes, to share meals, and occasionally to do absolutely nothing while waiting for the river to finish flooding. No one felt guilty because the fields were underwater. There was literally nothing else the fields could do. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson ancient Egypt leaves behind. Productivity wasn't measured hour by hour. It was measured harvest by harvest, generation by generation. The goal wasn't to squeeze every possible minute out of life. The goal was to create balance, to work when work was needed, to rest when rest was possible, to celebrate when there was something worth celebrating. And somehow, following that rhythm, ordinary people built one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. So, were ancient Egyptians better off than you? Probably not. Medicine, technology, and modern comforts have transformed our lives beyond anything they could have imagined. But if an Egyptian farmer could somehow visit today, watch us answer emails during dinner, check our phones before going to sleep, and apologise for taking a vacation, he might quietly look toward the nearest river and wonder whether, despite all our incredible inventions, we've accidentally made life far more complicated than it needed to be. Imagine arriving in a Celtic village just as dawn begins to lift the mist from the rolling hills. Thin streams of smoke curl upward from roundhouses with thatched roofs, carrying the comforting scent of peat fires that have been burning since before sunrise. Somewhere nearby, a wooden spoon scrapes the inside of an iron cauldron, sheep bleat from their pens, and someone is already grinding grain for the day's first meal. Breakfast is coming, but nobody is consulting a recipe. In the Celtic world, recipes live inside people's memories rather than on parchment. That is one of the greatest challenges facing historians today. Unlike the Romans, who delighted in writing about nearly everything, or medieval monks who carefully copied manuscripts, the ancient Celts left remarkably few written records of their everyday cooking. Most culinary knowledge was passed from parents to children, neighbour to neighbour, generation after generation. A daughter learned by standing beside her mother. A young shepherd learned by watching his grandmother stir a pot over the fire. If you asked for exact measurements, you would probably be handed a wooden spoon and told, "You'll know when it looks right." As a result, many authentic Celtic dishes disappeared quietly over the centuries. Not because they were forgotten overnight, but because traditions slowly changed. New crops arrived. New rulers introduced different tastes. Ancient customs blended with medieval ones, until the original recipes became almost impossible to separate from later adaptations. Fortunately, the ground has a surprisingly good memory. Archaeologists recover blackened cooking pots from settlements buried for more than 2,000 years. Tiny grains of barley and oats survive inside ancient storage pits. Burned hazelnut shells, crabapple seeds, and animal bones reveal what found its way into Celtic kitchens. Even microscopic traces of fats absorbed into pottery can tell researchers whether a vessel once held beef stew, dairy products, or something altogether different. It is less like reading a cookbook and more like solving an enormous culinary mystery with only a handful of clues. Ancient writers offer occasional glimpses as well, although they must be read carefully. Greek and Roman authors often described Celtic feasts with equal parts fascination and bewilderment. They admired the generous hospitality but rarely resisted adding dramatic flourishes. According to some accounts, every meal sounded as though it might end in either a heroic toast or an argument. Historians generally suspect the truth was rather less theatrical, though perhaps only slightly. The Celts themselves were never a single united people. They lived across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Gaul, and large parts of Central Europe, adapting their meals to local climates and landscapes. Yet despite these differences, common ingredients tied many communities together. Barley formed the backbone of countless meals. Oats thrived in cooler regions. Wild herbs, berries, mushrooms, honey, hazelnuts, apples, dairy products, and carefully preserved meats appeared throughout the Celtic world. Every ingredient reflected the rhythm of the seasons, because supermarkets had not yet committed the remarkable invention of stocking strawberries in the middle of winter. As we begin this journey through forgotten Celtic recipes, we are piecing together more than ancient meals. We are rediscovering the tastes, skills, and traditions of people whose kitchens have long since vanished, leaving only faint traces beneath the soil and echoes in old stories. Now that we know how historians piece together these forgotten meals, it is time to step inside the heart of a Celtic home. You might expect shelves lined with pots and pans, perhaps a neatly organised kitchen. Instead, your eyes are immediately drawn to one object that dominates the room: the cauldron. For the Celts, the cauldron was far more than a cooking pot. It was the centrepiece of daily life. Suspended over an open fire or resting directly among the glowing embers, it simmered from morning until night, producing meals that could feed an entire household and any unexpected guests who wandered through the door. Hospitality was one of the greatest virtues in Celtic society, and turning away a hungry traveller was considered deeply dishonourable. Fortunately, a large pot of stew has an impressive ability to stretch when another bowl is needed. Unlike modern recipes that begin with a precise list of ingredients, Celtic cooking depended on whatever the season had provided. A handful of barley might go into the pot first, followed by oats to thicken the broth. Then came vegetables gathered from nearby fields or gardens, such as onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, or wild carrots. Herbs like sorrel, watercress, wild garlic, or thyme added freshness without the need for imported spices. If meat was available, it became the star of the meal. Beef held particular prestige among many Celtic communities, reflecting the importance of cattle as both wealth and food. Pork was equally common, especially after autumn, when pigs had spent months feeding in oak forests rich with acorns. Mutton and goat appeared regularly, while venison occasionally arrived after a successful hunt. Fish filled the pot in coastal villages or settlements along rivers, where salmon, trout and eels were plentiful. The beauty of these stews was their flexibility. A successful cook understood balance rather than measurements. Too much grain made the stew heavy. Too much water left it thin and disappointing. Experience, rather than written instructions, determined when another handful of herbs was needed, or when the fire should be allowed to die down. Every family likely claimed their version was the best, much as families still do today, often with exactly the same level of confidence. The cauldron itself also carried symbolic meaning. In Celtic mythology, magical cauldrons possessed extraordinary powers. Some never ran empty, others restored life or granted wisdom. These legends probably reflected the enormous importance of the real cooking pot sitting in every household. A full cauldron meant security, community, and survival through another day. By evening, the stew would have grown richer as fresh ingredients joined those already simmering over the fire. Tomorrow's meal often began with what remained from today's, creating a continuous cycle of nourishment that wasted very little. In a world where every harvest mattered, the humble cauldron was not simply a kitchen tool. It was the quiet guardian of the Celtic table. As comforting as the ever-present cauldron was, not every meal could revolve around a bubbling pot. Shepherds spent long days on distant hillsides. Hunters disappeared into forests before sunrise. Traders followed winding paths between settlements for weeks at a time. They all needed food that could survive a journey without turning into an unfortunate science experiment. The answer came in the form of one of the oldest and most reliable Celtic foods, the humble oatcake. Unlike the soft loaves that fill modern bakeries, Celtic breads were dense, sturdy, and wonderfully practical. Wheat was difficult to grow across much of Ireland and Scotland, where cool temperatures and damp soils favoured hardier grains. Oats and barley became the true champions of the Celtic pantry, producing flour that could be mixed with water, a little salt, and occasionally buttermilk before being shaped into flat rounds. These simple cakes required no elaborate ovens. Instead, they were baked directly on a heated stone beside the fire or on a flat iron griddle. Within minutes, the dough formed a firm crust while remaining slightly soft inside. Once cooled, the cakes could last for several days, making them ideal companions for travellers and farmers alike. One close relative of these breads was the bannock, a thick, round flatbread whose descendants are still baked in parts of Scotland and Ireland today. While modern versions often include baking powder or butter, ancient bannocks relied entirely on simple ingredients available to nearly every household. Depending on the season, cooks might enrich the dough with rendered animal fat, fresh herbs, crushed hazelnuts, or even a drizzle of honey if the family had been fortunate enough to collect wild honeycomb. These breads were rarely eaten alone. A piece of warm oatcake became the perfect companion to a bowl of stew, soaking up every last drop of rich broth. Soft cheese spread easily across its rough surface. Fresh butter, when available, transformed an ordinary meal into something worthy of celebration. Even smoked salmon or slices of cured pork could be tucked between two oatcakes, proving that the idea of a portable sandwich is far older than most people imagine. Grinding the grain itself demanded patience. Women and children often spent hours using rotary querns or saddle querns, slowly crushing oats and barley into coarse flour. The rhythmic scraping of stone against stone became one of the familiar sounds of everyday Celtic life. It was exhausting work, but essential. Without flour, there was no bread, and without bread, even the richest stew felt incomplete. Perhaps the greatest strength of these forgotten recipes was their resilience. Oatcakes required few ingredients, wasted almost nothing, and nourished people through harsh winters and long journeys alike. They were never meant to impress guests with elegance. Instead, they quietly performed a far more important task, keeping entire communities fed, one simple round of bread at a time. While fields provided barley and oats, the forests supplied a second pantry that was every bit as important. To the ancient Celts, the woodland was not simply a place to hunt or gather firewood. It was a living storehouse of ingredients, changing with every season, and rewarding those who understood its rhythms. A skilled forager could return with enough food to transform an ordinary meal into something surprisingly varied. Autumn was perhaps the busiest time of year. Hazelnuts ripened in abundance and were eagerly collected by entire families. Archaeologists have uncovered enormous piles of discarded hazelnut shells at prehistoric sites across Ireland and Britain, evidence that these little nuts were eaten in astonishing quantities. Rich in oils and protein, they could be stored for months and ground into coarse meal to thicken stews, or mixed into bread dough. Their sweet, buttery flavour made them one of the closest things the Celts had to a luxury snack. Wild fruits also played an important role. Crab apples, sloes, blackberries, raspberries, elderberries, and rowan berries appeared as the seasons progressed. Some were pleasantly sweet, while others demanded patience. Sloes, for example, were famously bitter until the first frost softened their sharp taste. Even then, they were better suited to preserving, flavouring drinks, or slowly cooking into thick fruit pastes than eating straight from the bush. Anyone who ignored this advice usually discovered why facial expressions can become historical documents. Mushrooms added another layer of flavour, though gathering them required real expertise. The Celts likely passed down knowledge of edible species through generations, because confusing one mushroom with another could end a family dinner rather abruptly. While we cannot identify every variety they harvested, it is clear that woodland fungi formed part of their seasonal diet. Wild garlic carpeted many forest floors during spring, filling the air with its unmistakable aroma. Sorrel added a pleasant sourness to soups. Nettles, despite their unfriendly reputation, became nutritious greens once boiled. Dandelion leaves, watercress, and countless other edible plants found their way into cooking pots long before anyone labelled them as superfoods. To a Celtic cook, they were simply dinner. Honey was perhaps the forest's greatest treasure. Without sugarcane or imported sweeteners, wild honey provided one of the few natural ways to sweeten food. Collecting it was not an easy task. Beekeepers existed in some regions, but wild hives hidden inside hollow trees were especially prized. Harvesting them demanded courage, careful timing, and a willingness to tolerate a few angry bees. It was a small price to pay for something so precious that it flavoured breads, enriched sauces, and helped produce mead. The celebrated honey wine enjoyed during festivals and feasts. Together, these woodland ingredients gave Celtic cuisine a remarkable variety that often surprises modern readers. Their recipes were not built upon exotic imports from distant lands, but upon an intimate understanding of the landscape around them. Every season offered something new, and every successful forager knew that the forest rewarded those who paid close attention to its quiet generosity. By now, your table is beginning to look surprisingly familiar. There is a hearty stew simmering in the cauldron, fresh oatcakes cooling beside the fire, and a basket filled with hazelnuts and berries gathered from the forest. Yet something is still missing. Reach for the wooden bowl beside the hearth, and you will discover one of the most important parts of the Celtic diet: dairy. If cattle represented wealth, then milk represented everyday life. Across much of the Celtic world, cows grazed on open pastures from spring until autumn, producing a steady supply of fresh milk. Sheep and goats contributed as well, particularly in hillier regions where cattle were harder to maintain. Fresh milk was certainly enjoyed, but it had one obvious flaw. Without refrigeration, it spoiled quickly, especially during warmer months. Celtic families therefore became experts at transforming milk into foods that lasted far longer. Butter was among the most valued products. Churned by hand inside wooden vessels, it required patience and plenty of arm strength. The rhythmic motion could continue for an hour or more before golden clumps finally separated from the buttermilk. Once washed and salted, the butter became a precious source of calories that enriched bread, vegetables and stews. Remarkably, archaeologists have uncovered large blocks of what is known as bog butter across Ireland and parts of Scotland. Hidden inside wooden containers or wrapped in animal skins before being buried in cool peat bogs, some of these deposits are more than 2,000 years old. Why they were buried remains debated. Some may have been practical food storage, taking advantage of the bog's naturally cool, oxygen-poor environment. Others may have been ritual offerings to the gods. Either way, discovering ancient butter is probably one of archaeology's more unusual occupational hazards. Cheese proved even more practical. Simple soft cheeses could be made within a single day by curdling fresh milk with natural acids or rennet from young animals. These cheeses were mild, creamy and perfect for spreading across warm oat cakes. Harder varieties likely developed as methods improved, allowing families to preserve valuable nutrition throughout the winter months when fresh milk became scarce. Buttermilk itself never went to waste. Slightly tangy and refreshing, it served as a drink after long hours of labour and found its way into bread dough, making bannocks softer and more flavourful. Even the leftover whey from cheese making could be consumed or fed to livestock, ensuring that every drop of milk had a purpose. Ancient Irish law codes even reflected the importance of dairy. Cows were carefully valued, dairy rights were protected, and a household's prosperity was often measured by the quality of its livestock. A generous host was expected to offer guests fresh butter, cheese, or milk whenever possible. Refusing such hospitality would have been considered almost as strange as declining tea in certain parts of the British Isles today. These forgotten dairy traditions reveal a cuisine built not on extravagance, but on remarkable efficiency. Nothing was wasted. Every season demanded careful planning, and every bucket of milk offered several different possibilities. The Celts understood that preserving food was every bit as important as growing it, and thanks to their skill, simple ingredients could nourish a family long after the summer pastures had faded into winter. If you imagine the average Celtic family enjoying enormous roasted boars every evening, you can thank centuries of paintings, films, and enthusiastic storytellers. The truth was rather more modest. While meat certainly occupied an important place in Celtic culture, it was too valuable to appear at every ordinary meal. Most families relied far more on grains, dairy, and vegetables, with meat becoming the highlight of festivals, successful hunts, or important gatherings. That did not mean the Celts lacked livestock. Quite the opposite. Cattle stood at the very centre of Celtic society. They represented wealth, social status, and even political power. In early Irish law, fines were often calculated in cattle rather than coins, and raids to steal herds became legendary enough to inspire epic tales. Yet because cows produced milk year after year, slaughtering one was a serious decision. A healthy dairy cow was worth far more alive than roasted over a fire. Pigs, however, offered a different story. Unlike cattle, pigs matured relatively quickly and thrived in oak and beech forests, happily feeding on acorns, beech nuts, roots, and fallen fruit. Their ability to forage made them economical to raise, and pork became one of the most commonly eaten meats throughout the Celtic world. Ancient writers frequently remarked upon the impressive size of Celtic pigs, while archaeological excavations consistently uncover large numbers of pig bones at settlements. Fresh pork might be roasted over open flames during celebrations, but preservation was equally important. Large joints were rubbed generously with salt before being hung above smoky hearths, where weeks of slow smoking transformed them into food that could last through the winter. Every household understood that a successful autumn slaughter was really preparation for the colder months ahead. Wild game supplemented these domestic animals. Deer wandered the forests, while wild boar remained dangerous but highly prized quarry. Hunting required skill, patience, and no small amount of courage. A charging boar could inflict devastating injuries, making every successful hunt a genuine achievement, rather than simply an excuse for an impressive story around the fire. Birds also appeared on Celtic tables. Ducks, geese, grouse, pheasants, and smaller woodland birds were trapped or hunted according to the season. Along rivers and lakes, fish often replaced meat altogether. Salmon, trout, pike, perch, and especially eels provided dependable sources of protein. In coastal communities, shellfish, mussels, oysters, limpets, and crabs expanded the menu even further, proving that Celtic cuisine was far more diverse than many people imagine. When a feast finally arrived, roasting became a spectacle as much as a cooking method. Large cuts of meat turned slowly on wooden spits above glowing embers, while fat dripped into the flames, filling the air with an irresistible aroma. Guests gathered long before the food was ready, sharing stories, music, and cups of ale or mead as anticipation grew. By the time the meat was carved, the meal had already become a celebration of community as much as nourishment. These occasions were memorable precisely because they were uncommon. The everyday Celtic table was simple, practical, and shaped by necessity. But when the harvest was plentiful, a hunt successful, or an important festival called people together, forgotten recipes centered on roasted meats reminded everyone that food could nourish not only the body, but the bonds between family, friends, and the wider tribe. Most of the meals we have explored so far belong to ordinary days. They were practical, nourishing, and carefully planned to make the most of every harvest. But life in the Celtic world was not one endless cycle of work. Throughout the year, festivals interrupted the routine, bringing together entire communities to celebrate the changing seasons. And whenever the people gathered, the food changed too. One of the most important festivals was Samhain, celebrated at the end of autumn. It marked the conclusion of the harvest and the beginning of winter, a time when the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was believed to grow thinner. Families lit great bonfires, livestock were brought in from the summer pastures, and the final harvest was prepared for the difficult months ahead. Naturally, the table reflected the season. Freshly slaughtered pork often became the centerpiece of the feast, accompanied by rich stews made from root vegetables that stored well through winter. Turnips, carrots, onions, and leeks simmered together with barley until they formed thick, comforting dishes that warmed everyone gathered around the fire. Apples, harvested only weeks earlier, appeared roasted beside the flames or sliced into simple desserts sweetened with precious honey. Nuts also played a symbolic role. Hazelnuts and walnuts represented wisdom and abundance, and many traditional games involved cracking or roasting them over glowing embers. Some customs survived well into later Irish and Scottish folklore, although few people today realise their origins stretch back to ancient Celtic celebrations. Spring brought a very different menu. During Beltane, the festival welcoming summer, dairy products took centre stage once again. Cows returned to fresh grazing land, producing rich milk after the lean months of winter. Fresh butter, soft cheeses, and creamy milk appeared in generous quantities. Early herbs, young onions, and tender greens added fresh flavours that had been impossible to find only a few weeks earlier. After months of preserved foods, these first tastes of spring must have seemed almost miraculous. Lugna Sard, the harvest festival of late summer, celebrated grain above all else. Fresh barley was milled into flour for newly baked bannocks and oatcakes, while ale brewed from the recent harvest flowed freely during communal gatherings. Honey cakes, though simple by modern standards, became welcome treats reserved for special occasions rather than everyday meals. The festivals were never only about eating. Music echoed across the hills as harps, horns, and drums accompanied dancing that sometimes continued long after sunset. Storytellers recited heroic legends, while poets praised great families and generous hosts. Children chased one another between the fires, and merchants traded goods brought from distant regions. Every shared meal strengthened friendships, settled disputes, and reminded scattered communities that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Many of these festival recipes disappeared not because they lacked flavour, but because the celebrations themselves gradually changed. Christianity reshaped older traditions, new ingredients entered Europe, and generations adapted their cooking to new customs. Yet hidden beneath later holiday meals are faint echoes of those ancient Celtic feasts, where a simple loaf of fresh barley bread, a bowl of autumn stew, and a spoonful of honey were enough to celebrate another year of survival together. A meal in the Celtic world rarely ended with an empty cup. Whether gathered around a family hearth or seated at a great tribal feast, people expected something to drink alongside their food. Clean water was certainly available from springs and streams, but many of the beverages that accompanied forgotten Celtic recipes carried far richer flavours and far deeper cultural meaning. Perhaps the most famous was mead. Made by fermenting honey with water, mead was one of Europe's oldest alcoholic drinks, long predating many grape wines in northern regions. Since honey itself was difficult to obtain, producing mead required patience and valuable resources. It was not something casually prepared for an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Mead belonged to celebrations, weddings, religious festivals, and the welcoming of honoured guests. Its flavour varied enormously, depending on the flowers visited by the bees. Honey collected from heather-covered hills tasted different from honey gathered in woodland clearings or flowering meadows. Some brewers added herbs, berries, or crab apples to create subtle variations, making every batch slightly unique. Without laboratories or precise thermometers, fermentation relied entirely upon experience, observation, and perhaps a little optimism. Ale was far more common. For a Viking family, summer did not simply arrive, it was earned. After months of bitter winds, frozen fields, and nights that seemed to last forever, the first truly warm morning felt almost unbelievable. The snow retreated from the valleys, ice loosened its grip on the fjords, and tiny patches of green pushed stubbornly through the thawing earth. Streams that had stood silent beneath thick ice suddenly rushed with meltwater, while birds returned to the skies, filling the air with songs that had not been heard since the previous autumn. To modern people, summer often means vacations, beaches, and perhaps complaining that it is too hot. To the Vikings, it meant survival. Every important task that had been impossible during winter could finally begin. The Norse year revolved around the changing seasons, and none mattered more than summer. In Old Norse, the year itself was often divided into only two great halves, winter and summer. There was no elaborate four-season calendar as we think of today. Winter was the season of endurance. Summer was the season of opportunity. Entire villages seemed to wake from a long sleep. Doors that had remained shut against freezing winds were thrown open. Smoke drifted from rooftops as people cooked outdoors once again. Children, who had spent months crowded inside smoky longhouses, raced across fresh grass with enough energy to exhaust even the family dog. Chickens wandered freely through farmyards, sheep returned to higher pastures, and cattle finally found fresh grazing after surviving on stored hay throughout the dark months. The change affected people just as much as animals. After spending much of winter repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth, carving wood, and telling stories beside the hearth, everyone suddenly found themselves working beneath nearly endless daylight. In northern Scandinavia, the sun lingered so long that darkness barely arrived at all. There were precious hours to plough fields, repair fences, fish along the coast, collect timber, and prepare ships. Every day felt longer, not because people worked harder, although they certainly did, but because nature itself had given them more time. There was little room for laziness. The growing season in Scandinavia was surprisingly short. Farmers had only a few months to sow barley and oats, tend livestock, gather wild plants, cut hay, and prepare enough food to survive another winter. Every clear day counted. A delayed harvest or poor summer could mean genuine hardship once the snow returned. Yet despite the endless work, summer also brought something winter could not: optimism. Neighbours who had rarely travelled beyond their own farms during snowy months began visiting again. Small paths across forests reopened as the ground dried. Boats crossed lakes that had only recently been frozen solid. Markets slowly filled with familiar faces. Laughter echoed between farmsteads, and news spread rapidly from one settlement to another. After months of isolation, people were connected once more. Most importantly, the sea was alive again. The fjords no longer lay trapped beneath floating ice. Gentle waves carried fishing boats back onto the water, while larger longships rested along the shore, waiting patiently for the crews who would soon push them toward distant horizons. For the Vikings, summer was not simply the warmest season of the year. It was the season when the entire world suddenly became accessible again, and with it came endless possibilities. As the villages came alive with the arrival of summer, another transformation was taking place down by the shoreline. The longhouses might have been the heart of a Viking settlement during winter, but in summer, attention shifted toward the harbour. Every path seemed to lead to the water, where rows of longships waited patiently beneath protective shelters, ready to return to the sea after months of inactivity. A Viking ship was far too valuable to leave floating through the winter. Storms, drifting ice, and constant moisture would slowly damage even the finest vessel. Instead, many ships were pulled ashore during autumn and carefully supported on wooden cradles. There they remained throughout the cold months, while their owners inspected every beam, repaired every crack, and prepared for another season of sailing. The first warm weeks of summer became one enormous shipyard. Carpenters replaced damaged oak planks that had split during the winter frost. Blacksmiths forged fresh nails and rivets. Ropes made from hemp or animal hair were carefully checked for weak spots, while sailmakers repaired woolen sails that had been torn by fierce winds the previous year. Every piece mattered. A single loose plank or frayed rope could become a deadly problem once the ship reached the open sea. Even the tar received careful attention. The Vikings waterproofed their ships using pine tar, a thick black substance produced by slowly heating pine wood under controlled conditions. The smell was unmistakable. Entire harbours filled with the rich scent of fresh tar as crews brushed it across the hulls, protecting the wood from seawater and rot. It was messy work that covered hands, clothes, and probably faces as well. Looking impressive was not the priority. Keeping the ship afloat generally ranked much higher. The sails demanded just as much respect. Unlike modern canvas, Viking sails were woven from tightly spun wool. Producing enough cloth for a single large sail required enormous effort. Hundreds of sheep contributed wool, while countless hours of spinning, weaving, and sewing transformed it into one of the most expensive parts of the vessel. Some historians estimate that making a sail could take years of labour. When the crew carefully unfolded it each spring, they were handling something worth almost as much as the ship itself. As repairs continued, excitement quietly spread through the settlement. Young boys dreamed of joining their first voyage. Experienced sailors exchanged stories about distant rivers, bustling markets, and foreign kingdoms they hoped to visit again. Merchants counted their trade goods, while chieftains discussed alliances, expeditions, and the crews they would assemble. Not every ship was preparing for war. Many would spend the summer fishing along the coast or transporting families between neighbouring settlements. Others would carry merchants across the North Sea to England or south toward the bustling trading towns of Denmark and the Baltic. Some ventured even farther, reaching Iceland, Greenland, or the great rivers that led deep into Eastern Europe, and eventually toward Constantinople. By the time the final repairs were complete, the shoreline no longer resembled a quiet fishing village. It had become the starting point of an entire season of movement. With the ships once again resting on the water instead of the land, summer had truly begun, and the Viking world was ready to set sail. With the longships repaired and launched, the shoreline slowly emptied. One by one, vessels disappeared beyond the mouth of the fjord, their striped woolen sails catching the steady summer breeze. For many Vikings, this was the moment they had anticipated all winter. Summer did not simply allow them to travel, it reopened an entire world that had been inaccessible for months. The sea became Scandinavia's greatest highway. Unlike muddy forest tracks or snow-covered mountain passes, the ocean connected people rather than separating them. A skilled crew could cover astonishing distances, following familiar coastlines by day and navigating with the stars, the sun, and generations of accumulated experience. Every voyage carried risk, but it also carried opportunity. Many people imagine every Viking ship sailing off in search of battle. In reality, a great number were loaded not with warriors, but with merchants and cargo. Trade was one of the foundations of Viking prosperity, and summer was its busiest season. The ships carried products that Northern Europe valued highly. Bundles of soft animal furs from foxes, martens and beavers filled storage chests. Walrus ivory from the Arctic promised handsome profits. Amber collected along Baltic shores glowed like captured sunlight, while iron tools, whetstones, timber, honey, and finely crafted weapons completed the cargo. Every item represented months of work back home. In return, the Vikings sought goods unavailable in Scandinavia. Silver coins arrived from the Islamic world in astonishing quantities, eventually becoming so common that thousands have been discovered buried across Scandinavia. Fine silk travelled from Byzantium. Colourful glass beads reached northern villages through complex trade networks, and spices such as pepper occasionally found their way into the possessions of wealthy families. Even someone living on a remote Norwegian fjord could eventually own an object that had begun its journey thousands of miles away. The marketplaces themselves were remarkable places. Trading towns like Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang, and Ribe became bustling centres every summer. Languages from across Europe echoed through crowded streets. Scandinavian merchants bargained with Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Slavs, Finns, and traders from lands far beyond the Baltic. Walking through one of these markets meant seeing unfamiliar clothing, strange animals, exotic foods, and technologies from distant cultures. It was the medieval equivalent of discovering that your quiet fishing village had suddenly become an international airport. Trade also spread ideas. A merchant returning home brought far more than silver. He carried stories about foreign kings, unfamiliar religions, advanced shipbuilding techniques, new styles of jewellery, and different ways of farming or building houses. Every successful voyage expanded the Vikings' understanding of the wider world. Some expeditions pushed even farther. Swedish traders navigated the great rivers of Eastern Europe toward the Black Sea and Constantinople, while Norwegian sailors ventured west across the Atlantic to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. These extraordinary journeys were only possible because summer provided the calm seas, longer daylight, and milder weather needed for such ambitious travel. By midsummer, the Viking world was no longer isolated villages scattered along cold coastlines. Thanks to their ships, it had become part of a vast network stretching across 3 continents. Every departing sail carried the promise of profit, adventure, and discovery, ensuring that summer remained the season when the horizons of the Norse world grew wider than ever before. As merchants disappeared toward distant markets and explorers chased new horizons, not every Viking spent the summer far from home. For many families, this season meant something just as exciting: reunion. Winter had scattered people in unexpected ways. Some sons had worked on neighbouring farms, others had guarded trading posts or hunted deep in the forests. Sailors who had survived the previous year's voyages often returned home only after the first safe sailing weather arrived. Summer became the season when empty benches around the dinner table slowly filled again. The arrival of a ship was rarely a quiet affair. Long before the vessel reached the beach, someone standing on a rocky headland spotted its sail on the horizon. Word spread through the settlement with remarkable speed. Children abandoned their games and raced toward the shoreline. Dogs barked excitedly. Families gathered at the harbour, trying to recognise familiar faces among the crew long before the ship came close enough to identify anyone. The waiting could feel endless, even though the vessel grew larger with every passing minute. When the keel finally scraped against the sand, greetings often mattered more than the cargo. Parents embraced sons they had not seen for months. Brothers exchanged stories before they had even unloaded the ship. Children met fathers who returned carrying strange objects from lands they could scarcely imagine. A carved piece of walrus ivory from Greenland, a colourful glass bead from the Baltic, or a tiny silver coin from distant Arabia became treasures not because of their value, but because they carried a story from the wider world. The longhouse quickly became busy again. Extra sleeping spaces were prepared, benches filled with relatives, and cooking pots seemed permanently occupied. Meals naturally became larger. Fresh fish, newly baked barley bread, butter, smoked meats, and bowls of thick stew disappeared quickly as hungry travellers made up for weeks of simple shipboard food. After months of dried fish and preserved supplies, eating fresh produce from home must have felt like a feast worthy of the gods. Of course, the conversations lasted far longer than the meals. As daylight lingered well into the evening, families sat outside or around the central hearth, listening to stories from distant shores. Sailors described enormous rivers in the east, crowded markets overflowing with foreign goods, towering churches in England, or dangerous storms that nearly tore their ships apart. Every tale carried a mixture of truth, exaggeration, and the natural tendency of travellers to become slightly more heroic with each retelling. Fortunately, nobody seemed to mind. Summer was also the preferred season for weddings, legal assemblies, and large family gatherings. Roads were dry, rivers navigable, and travel relatively safe, allowing relatives from scattered settlements to meet in numbers that would have been impossible during winter. New friendships formed, marriages were arranged, disputes settled, and alliances renewed over generous meals and shared cups of ale. These reunions strengthened Viking society in ways that extended far beyond individual households. A successful summer was measured not only by good harvests or profitable voyages, but by the chance to reconnect with people separated by the long northern winter. For a few precious months, the scattered farms and isolated fjords became part of one living community once again, reminding everyone that no voyage was complete until it ended back home. By the time families had reunited and the harbours echoed once again with familiar voices, another welcome change was taking place across the countryside. The tables inside Viking longhouses began to look very different from those of winter. Gone were the weeks of relying almost entirely on smoked meat, dried fish, and whatever had survived in storage. Summer brought abundance, and nowhere was that more obvious than at mealtime. For the average Viking family, this was the season when fresh food finally returned. The cows, which had spent months surviving on carefully rationed hay, now grazed on lush green pastures. Their richer diet meant better milk, and with it came fresh butter, soft cheeses, buttermilk, and cream. Dairy products became daily staples once again, filling wooden bowls and clay cups that had stood nearly empty during the harshest months of winter. The sheep and goats benefited as well. Their milk added variety to the household, while young lambs and kids filled the hillsides with constant noise. For children, summer was not only warmer, it tasted better. The gardens surrounding the farms also burst into life. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, broad beans and hardy herbs matured beneath the long northern daylight. Wild plants such as sorrel, nettles, angelica, and wild garlic were gathered from nearby meadows and forests, adding fresh flavours to soups and stews. After months of preserved foods, even a handful of newly picked herbs could completely transform an ordinary meal. Fishing reached its busiest period. Boats left the shore almost every morning, returning with cod, herring, salmon, trout, and mackerel depending on the region. Fish that were eaten immediately required little preparation beyond cleaning and roasting over an open fire. Others were salted or dried while the weather remained favourable, quietly building the food reserves that would be essential once winter returned. The forests contributed generously too. Blueberries, raspberries, cloudberries, strawberries and blackberries ripened one after another as the weeks passed. Hazelnuts had not yet fully matured, but mushrooms began appearing after warm summer rains. Honey collected from wild bees sweetened special meals, while fresh eggs from domestic birds became far more plentiful than they had been only a few months earlier. Even bread improved. New grain had not yet been harvested, but households carefully stretched the last stores of barley and oats while eagerly anticipating the coming harvest. Fresh butter spread across warm flatbreads must have seemed almost luxurious after the repetitive meals of late winter. Sometimes the simplest combinations are the most satisfying, especially when you have spent several months wondering whether another dried fish might finally start tasting different. History suggests it probably did not. Summer feasts reflected this remarkable abundance. Large cauldrons simmered with fresh vegetables, fish, or meat when available, while tables filled with cheeses, breads, berries, and generous cups of ale. Visitors were welcomed warmly, partly because hospitality was an important Viking virtue, and partly because it was much easier to be generous when nature itself was being generous. These months reminded every Viking family why the long winter had been worth enduring. Summer was not simply a season of warmth. It was the brief but precious time when the land, the sea, and the forests all seemed determined to reward their patience, before the cold inevitably returned once more. As the fields turned green and the tables grew fuller, people finally had something else they had been waiting for since the first snowfall: time to gather. Winter had kept most families close to their own farms. Snow-covered mountain passes, frozen rivers, and dangerous seas made long journeys difficult and often unnecessary. But summer changed everything. The roads dried, rivers became navigable, and the fjords turned into busy highways. Suddenly, people who had not seen one another for months could travel freely again. This was the season of the great assemblies. Across Scandinavia, communities met at regional gatherings known as things, where free men came together to settle disputes, approve laws, negotiate marriages, resolve property disagreements, and make important political decisions. These meetings were far more than simple courts. They were among the largest social events of the year. People often travelled for days to attend. Entire families loaded supplies onto horses or small boats before making the journey. Children experienced villages they had never visited before, while older relatives reunited with cousins, friends, and trading partners they might only see once each year. Camps sprang up around the meeting places, transforming quiet valleys into lively temporary towns. Business happened everywhere. Merchants spread blankets displaying finely crafted knives, colourful glass beads, woven cloth, iron tools, carved combs made from antler, and jewellery of silver or bronze. Farmers exchanged livestock, fishermen traded dried cod, and craftsmen accepted commissions for the months ahead. A successful gathering could provide enough business to support an artisan well into the following winter. Naturally, no Viking gathering was complete without entertainment. Skalds recited long heroic poems celebrating famous warriors and legendary kings. Their remarkable memories allowed them to perform stories that stretched back generations, preserving history long before it appeared in writing. Nearby, musicians played harps, bone flutes, and horns, while dancers filled the open spaces between the tents. Games attracted just as much attention. Young men tested their strength through wrestling matches and stone lifting contests. Archery competitions demonstrated hunting skills, while swimming races and rowing contests took advantage of nearby lakes and rivers. Children invented their own games nearby, proving that regardless of the century, giving a group of energetic youngsters an open field usually produces exactly the same result: complete chaos within minutes. Summer was also the preferred season for weddings. Travel was easier, food was plentiful, and entire extended families could attend without risking dangerous winter journeys. A marriage united not only two individuals, but often two powerful families. Negotiations that had begun months earlier were finally celebrated with generous feasts, gifts, music, and days of shared celebration. Even religion found its place during these gatherings. Seasonal sacrifices and communal feasts honoured the Norse gods, asking for continued good harvests, safe voyages, and prosperity. These ceremonies reinforced the bonds that connected every member of the community, from wealthy chieftains to ordinary farmers. By the end of summer, countless agreements had been made, friendships renewed, marriages celebrated, and stories shared. The Vikings understood that a successful society depended on more than ships and swords. It also depended on people coming together whenever the season finally allowed it. After the isolation of winter, those precious months of reunion became just as valuable as the harvest itself. By now, summer had brought the Vikings full harbours, overflowing tables and bustling gatherings. Yet, for many people, the season held one final promise that made it unlike any other: adventure. The long northern winter demanded caution. Summer rewarded curiosity. Once the fields had been planted and the livestock safely grazing, many Vikings found themselves with a rare opportunity to travel beyond the familiar coastline. Not everyone sailed to raid foreign kingdoms or trade in distant cities. Many journeys were far smaller but no less meaningful. Families visited relatives across the fjords, fishermen explored new waters, hunters ventured deeper into mountain valleys, and young people experienced places they had only heard about during winter evenings around the fire. For teenagers especially, summer offered a taste of freedom. A young Viking who had spent the winter repairing fences, feeding animals, and hauling firewood might finally be allowed to join an older sibling on a coastal voyage. Others accompanied merchants to nearby trading towns or helped transport livestock between seasonal pastures. These trips were more than work. They became lessons in navigation, negotiation, and survival that no storyteller could fully teach inside a smoky longhouse. The landscape itself invited exploration. Snow had finally disappeared from the mountain passes, revealing trails that had remained hidden for months. Rivers became safe to cross. Forests filled with edible plants and game, and waterfalls thundered with fresh snowmelt. Entire regions that had been unreachable during winter suddenly welcomed travellers again. Scandinavia felt larger during summer, not because it had changed, but because people could finally experience all of it. Many expeditions were surprisingly peaceful. Groups of fishermen established temporary camps along remote coastlines where fish were especially abundant. Hunters spent weeks pursuing reindeer or elk through the highlands. Farmers moved cattle and sheep toward upland grazing grounds, living in small summer settlements where the animals could feed on rich mountain grasses. These seasonal migrations had been practiced for generations and became an important rhythm of rural life. Children often accompanied these journeys, turning them into unforgettable adventures. They learned how to recognize safe berries, identify animal tracks, build simple shelters, and read the weather by watching clouds gather over distant peaks. In the summer of 1492, Christopher Columbus stood at the edge of Spain with a plan that sounded either brilliant or completely unreasonable. He intended to reach the wealthy markets of Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic, a route no European expedition had successfully completed. The world was not believed to be flat, despite the stubborn survival of that myth. The real argument was distance. Columbus believed Asia was much closer than most educated geographers calculated. He was wrong, but history occasionally rewards confidence before checking the mathematics. For years, Columbus had carried his proposal from court to court. He sought ships, money, supplies, and royal approval, receiving mostly delays and rejection. Portuguese advisers dismissed his estimates. Spanish officials examined the plan and remained doubtful. Yet Columbus continued pressing his case with remarkable persistence. He promised access to spices, gold, trade routes, and new lands for Christianity. Eventually, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon agreed to support the expedition. Their decision came shortly after the conquest of Granada, which ended the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. Spain was entering a new political era and looking outward. Columbus offered the possibility of wealth without challenging Portugal's established roots around Africa. It was an enormous gamble, but by royal standards, a comparatively affordable one. Preparations began in the port of Palos. Columbus received 3 vessels: the larger Santa Maria, which became his flagship, and the smaller caravels Pinta and Niña. The caravels were light, fast, and well suited to exploration. The Santa Maria carried more supplies but sailed more slowly, rather like the heavily packed relative who insists everyone else is walking too quickly. Recruiting the crew was not simple. Many sailors feared the voyage, not because they expected to fall from the edge of the world, but because the Atlantic was vast, unpredictable, and poorly understood. The respected Pinzon brothers helped secure experienced men and brought credibility to the expedition. Eventually, around 90 sailors joined the fleet. They loaded barrels of water and wine, salted meat, dried fish, beans, flour, cheese, oil, and hard ship's biscuit. Tools, weapons, spare timber, ropes, trade goods, and religious banners filled the remaining space. Every item had to survive months at sea, preferably without developing a personality of its own. Before sunrise on the 3rd of August, 1492, the ships left Palos. Families watched from shore as the sails caught the wind, and the vessels moved downriver toward the open sea. Columbus believed he was beginning a direct journey to Asia. Instead, he was sailing toward lands unknown to Europe, and toward a meeting that would transform the history of the world. With the ships finally underway, Columbus and his crew did not immediately plunge into the unknown Atlantic. Their first destination lay just off the northwest coast of Africa, the Canary Islands. This Spanish-held archipelago served as the last familiar stop before the expedition committed itself to the immense ocean beyond. The pause proved necessary almost at once. The Pinta, one of the fleet's fastest caravels, developed problems with its rudder shortly after leaving Spain. Some believed the damage was simply bad luck. Others suspected sabotage by owners who had never wanted the vessel to undertake such a dangerous voyage. Whatever the cause, the repairs delayed the expedition for several weeks. The crew replaced damaged equipment, adjusted the rigging, and took advantage of the opportunity to restock fresh water, food, and firewood. Most importantly, they waited for the right winds. The Canary Islands sat perfectly within the northeast trade winds, steady currents of air that carried ships westward across the Atlantic. Columbus understood these winds from previous voyages along the African coast. Rather than fighting the ocean, he intended to let nature do much of the work. It was one of the greatest strengths of his navigation, although at the time, few aboard the ships appreciated just how important those predictable winds would become. On the 6th of September, 1492, the fleet departed the Canaries. This time, there would be no more familiar ports. As the islands slowly disappeared below the horizon, many sailors experienced a feeling they had never known before. European coastlines were gone. No fishing boats appeared in the distance. No merchant vessels crossed their path. Ahead stretched nothing but open ocean. Life aboard the 3 ships quickly settled into a demanding routine. Each vessel carried a crew that worked in rotating watches throughout the day and night. Sailors trimmed the sails as the wind shifted, repaired ropes worn by constant tension, pumped water from the bilges, cleaned the decks, and prepared simple meals from salted meat, dried legumes, hard biscuit, and wine. Fresh food disappeared quickly, leaving everyone to become increasingly familiar with meals that required more determination than enthusiasm to eat. Navigation demanded Columbus's constant attention. Without modern instruments, he relied on a magnetic compass, the position of the sun, observations of the stars, and a method known as dead reckoning, estimating the fleet's position by calculating speed, direction, and time travelled. It was far from perfect, especially over thousands of miles of open water. To keep morale from collapsing, Columbus adopted an unusual strategy. He secretly maintained 2 different records of the distance sailed. In his private log, he recorded what he believed to be the true distance travelled. But to the crew, he announced smaller figures each day. By making the voyage seem shorter than it really was, he hoped the sailors would worry less about how impossibly far they had already ventured from home. For a while, the deception worked. The weather remained calm, the trade winds pushed the ship steadily westward, and confidence remained surprisingly high. Yet with every sunrise, Europe slipped farther behind them. The familiar world was now hundreds of miles away, and ahead lay only an empty horizon that seemed to stretch forever. None of the men aboard could know whether they were sailing toward unimaginable riches, complete failure, or a destination no European had ever recorded. By the second week at sea, the excitement of departure had begun to fade. The Canary Islands were long gone, and with them disappeared the last reassuring reminder of Europe. Every morning, the sailors climbed onto the deck, hoping to glimpse land on the horizon. Every morning they found exactly the same answer: water in every direction. The Atlantic seemed endless. For most of the crew, this was unlike any voyage they had ever experienced. Coastal sailors were accustomed to seeing familiar landmarks or passing merchant vessels. Even when land disappeared briefly, they knew another shoreline would soon appear. Columbus's expedition offered no such comfort. Day after day, the horizon formed a perfect circle around the ships, making it feel as though they were standing still, while the ocean quietly swallowed the world behind them. Life aboard the three vessels settled into a repetitive rhythm. The sailors worked in shifts throughout the day and night, trimming sails, checking rigging, steering by compass, pumping seawater from the hull, and constantly repairing equipment worn by salt, wind, and endless movement. There were no days off. The sea did not recognize weekends. Meals became increasingly monotonous. Hard ship's biscuit formed the foundation of nearly every meal. When freshly baked in Spain, these biscuits had been merely dry. After weeks at sea, they became considerably harder, and occasionally hosted tiny unwanted passengers in the form of insects. Salted pork and beef provided protein, although the meat grew tougher with time. Dried peas, beans, olive oil, cheese and wine completed the daily diet. Fresh water remained carefully rationed, as every barrel represented survival. The ocean itself, however, began offering strange surprises. Large floating fields of seaweed appeared ahead, covering enormous stretches of water. Today, we know this region as the Sargasso Sea, but to Columbus's crew it seemed mysterious and unsettling. Some wondered whether the thick mats of seaweed might trap the ships forever. Others feared they had entered waters no one would ever escape. In reality, the vessels sailed through without difficulty, but fear has a remarkable talent for inventing problems before they actually exist. Then came the birds. Small seabirds occasionally circled above the fleet before disappearing again. Since birds usually remained relatively close to land, their appearance lifted everyone's spirits. Floating branches, patches of green vegetation, and even carved pieces of wood drifting on the current seemed to promise that land could not be far away. Each hopeful sign, however, ended the same way. Another day passed. Then another. As September gave way to October, confidence slowly began to crack. The steady trade winds that had carried the ships westward so efficiently now created a new concern. Several sailors quietly asked an uncomfortable question. If the wind always blew from the east, how would they ever sail back home? Columbus understood that different wind systems existed farther north, but he had never tested that theory across the Atlantic. To the crew, it appeared they had sailed into a giant ocean from which there might be no return. Whispers spread from one ship to another. Some men suggested Columbus had misjudged the distance completely. Others questioned whether Asia existed where he claimed. The officers tried to maintain discipline, but growing frustration became harder to ignore with each passing sunrise. The ocean remained calm, the ships remained sound, yet something far more dangerous than storms had begun to build aboard the expedition. Doubt, the doubt that had quietly spread through the fleet, was now approaching a breaking point. By early October 1492, the sailors had spent more than a month crossing an ocean that seemed determined to offer nothing but empty horizons. Columbus continued to insist that Asia lay just ahead, but each sunrise made his confidence more difficult to share. The men had followed him farther west than any of them had ever imagined possible, and many believed they were risking their lives for a dream that simply did not exist. Tension filled every ship. According to later accounts, some sailors demanded that Columbus abandon the voyage and turn back before it was too late. Whether the discussions came close to outright mutiny remains debated by historians, but there is little doubt that tempers were rising. Columbus faced the greatest challenge of the expedition, not from the sea, but from his own crew. He refused to change course. Instead, he promised that if land did not appear within a few more days, they would seriously consider returning to Spain. It was a calculated decision that bought him precious time. Whether he truly intended to keep that promise is impossible to know. Fortunately for Columbus, the Atlantic was about to reward his persistence. Almost immediately, the signs began to multiply. A branch floated past carrying fresh green leaves that could not have survived long at sea. Another sailor spotted a carved walking stick, clearly shaped by human hands. Clumps of fresh vegetation drifted alongside the ships, while flocks of small birds flew steadily toward the southwest each evening. Experienced sailors knew birds often returned to land before nightfall. The crew eagerly watched their flight paths, hoping they pointed towards solid ground. Hope returned almost overnight. Every man climbed into the rigging whenever possible, scanning the horizon with aching eyes. Columbus even announced a reward from the Spanish crown, an annual pension for the first sailor to spot land. Suddenly, everyone wanted to become the hero who ended the voyage. On the evening of the 11th of October, excitement became almost unbearable. Columbus himself claimed he saw a faint light flickering in the distance, as though someone were carrying a torch far across the water. The light appeared briefly, disappeared, then appeared again before vanishing into the darkness. Historians still debate exactly what he saw. It may have been a fire on shore, a moving lantern, or simply a trick of exhausted eyes. Whatever the explanation, nobody aboard slept easily that night. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October, everything changed. From aboard the Pinta, sailor Rodrigo de Triana shouted the words every man had been praying to hear. "Land!" The cry echoed across the silent sea. Within moments, lanterns flickered to life as sailors rushed onto the decks. Ahead, beneath the pale moonlight, a dark outline emerged from the horizon. It was not another illusion. It was unmistakably an island. At daybreak, the 3 ships anchored offshore. Columbus dressed in his finest clothes before stepping into a small boat. Carrying the royal banners of Castile and Aragon, he came ashore and formally claimed the island for the Spanish crown. He named it San Salvador, although the Taino people who already lived there knew it as Guanahani. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia. In reality, he had arrived in the Caribbean, unknowingly opening a chapter of history that would reshape continents, transform empires, and forever change the lives of millions of people on both sides of the Atlantic. The greatest journey of his life had reached land, but the greatest consequences of that voyage were only just beginning. As the excitement of finally reaching land began to settle, Columbus and his crew stepped into a world unlike anything they had ever known. The beaches were lined with brilliant white sand. The forests glowed with shades of green unfamiliar to European eyes, and the warm Caribbean air carried the scent of flowers instead of salt and damp wool. After more than 2 months at sea, the island must have seemed almost unreal. Yet the greatest discovery was not the landscape. It was the people. The island was home to the Taino, an indigenous people who had lived throughout much of the Caribbean for generations. As the Europeans came ashore, curious islanders cautiously approached. Neither side could speak the other's language. There were no translators, no dictionaries, and no shared words. Every conversation depended entirely upon gestures, smiles, and careful observation. Columbus later described the Taino as welcoming and generous. According to his journal, they offered the newcomers cotton thread, parrots, fruit, and small ornaments made of gold in exchange for simple European objects such as glass beads, bells, and red caps. To the Taino, these colourful foreign items may have seemed just as fascinating as gold ornaments appeared to the Spaniards. Each side valued entirely different things, creating one of history's most remarkable first exchanges. The Europeans carefully studied everything they saw. The Taino villages consisted of neat circular houses built from wood, palm leaves, and reeds. Unlike the stone castles of Europe, these homes blended naturally into the tropical environment. Families slept in woven cotton hammocks suspended above the ground, a design that immediately impressed the sailors. After weeks of trying to sleep aboard constantly rocking ships, many probably looked at the hammocks with considerable professional interest. The surrounding fields were equally surprising. Instead of wheat or barley, the Taino cultivated cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, beans, peppers, and tobacco. Many of these crops were completely unknown in Europe. Columbus recognized that the people were skilled farmers who understood the local climate perfectly, even if the plants themselves appeared unfamiliar to him. The natural beauty of the islands strengthened Columbus's conviction that he had reached Asia. Because he expected to find islands off the eastern coast of Asia, he interpreted everything through that belief. He searched constantly for signs of wealthy kingdoms, bustling cities, and the spices that had motivated the expedition from the beginning. Whenever local people mentioned larger islands nearby, Columbus became convinced they were describing places like Japan or the Chinese mainland. The small pieces of gold worn by some Taino attracted particular attention. Columbus eagerly asked through signs where the metal came from. The islanders pointed toward other islands, suggesting that more gold could be found elsewhere. Whether they simply meant neighbouring communities or larger sources of gold, Columbus interpreted every gesture as confirmation that vast riches lay just beyond the horizon. Despite the friendliness of these first meetings, the two worlds understood remarkably little about one another. The Taino saw unusual visitors arriving in floating wooden houses with enormous white wings. The Europeans believed they had reached the edge of Asia, completely unaware they had encountered civilizations entirely unknown to them. Both sides were curious. Both tried to communicate. Neither could possibly imagine how profoundly this first meeting would alter the future. What began as an exchange of gifts and cautious smiles would soon become one of the most consequential encounters in human history. The friendly encounters on Guanahani only strengthened Columbus's determination to continue. He was grateful to have reached land, but he remained convinced that greater discoveries lay just over the horizon. Somewhere nearby, he believed, were the wealthy cities of Asia, the courts of powerful rulers, and the vast stores of gold and spices that had inspired his voyage in the first place. So the expedition sailed on. Leaving the Bahamas behind, the three ships threaded their way through brilliant turquoise waters scattered with countless islands. The Caribbean was unlike any sea the Europeans had ever crossed. Coral reefs shimmered beneath the clear water, colourful fish darted below the hulls, and dense forests reached almost to the shoreline. Every bay seemed to promise another discovery. Columbus carefully questioned the Taino people wherever he landed. Through gestures and interpreters, he had begun taking aboard from previous islands. He repeatedly asked the same questions. Where was the gold? Where were the great cities? Where ruled the powerful kings he expected to meet? The answers rarely matched his expectations. In late October, the expedition reached the enormous island now known as Cuba. Columbus became convinced he had finally reached part of mainland Asia. The coastline stretched so far into the distance that it seemed impossible for it to be another island. Certain he was approaching the dominions of the Great Khan, whose empire Marco Polo had described centuries earlier, Columbus even sent small parties inland, hoping to find magnificent cities and imperial officials. Instead, they found quiet villages, cultivated fields and forests unlike anything in Europe. The explorers encountered tobacco for the first time. They watched local people rolling dried leaves together, lighting one end and inhaling the smoke. To the Europeans, the practice appeared deeply unusual. Few could have imagined that tobacco would one day become one of the most influential crops carried back across the Atlantic. From Cuba, the expedition continued eastward until reaching the large island of Hispaniola. Here Columbus believed he had finally found the richest lands of all. The island possessed fertile valleys, broad rivers, towering mountains, and small quantities of gold worn by local inhabitants. The landscapes impressed him so deeply that he later described them among the most beautiful he had ever seen. Then disaster struck. On Christmas Day, 1492, while sailing along the northern coast of Hispaniola, the Santa Maria ran aground on a hidden sandbank or reef. The flagship became firmly stuck. Despite desperate efforts by the crew, the waves slowly pushed the vessel onto its side, breaking apart its timbers. The expedition's largest ship could not be saved. Fortunately, the local Taino leader, known as Guacanagari, welcomed the stranded sailors with remarkable generosity. His people helped rescue supplies, weapons, food, and equipment before the wreck completely collapsed. Without their assistance, the expedition might have lost far more than a single ship. Since the Santa Maria could not be repaired, Columbus made a difficult decision. Using its salvaged timber, the crew constructed a small wooden fort on the coast, naming it La Navidad because the ship had been lost on Christmas. With only the much smaller Niña available, there was not enough room for every sailor to return to Spain. 39 men volunteered or were ordered to remain behind. As Columbus prepared to sail home, he left them with food, weapons, and instructions to maintain friendly relations with the local people until he returned. He believed he was leaving behind the first European settlement in Asia. In reality, it was the first permanent Spanish outpost in the Americas, marking the beginning of a far larger story than anyone standing on those tropical shores could possibly imagine. With the fort of La Navidad completed and 39 men left behind on Hispaniola, Columbus turned his attention to the final challenge of the expedition. Reaching the Caribbean had been an extraordinary achievement, but none of it would matter if he failed to carry the news back to Spain. A discovery unknown to Europe was no discovery at all. There was one immediate problem. The Santa Maria lay shattered along the shore, leaving only the Niña to carry most of the expedition home. Fortunately, the Pinta, which had become separated from the fleet several weeks earlier under the command of Martín Alonso Pinzón, unexpectedly reappeared. The reunion was a tremendous relief, although Columbus privately suspected that Pinzón had wandered off in search of gold on his own. Whatever disagreements existed between the two captains, This was hardly the moment to argue. The Atlantic still lay between them and home. On the 16th of January, 1493, the two remaining ships raised their sails and left the Caribbean behind. The journey east proved very different from the voyage west. Instead of relying on the trade winds that had carried them toward the Americas, Columbus deliberately steered north into unfamiliar waters, searching for the stronger westerly winds that blew back toward Europe. It was a risky decision, but one based on careful observation. His understanding of Atlantic wind patterns would later become one of the foundations of regular crossings between Europe and the New World.